Welcome to your Essential Business Briefing. I'm Stephen Carroll. Coming up, is the global economic recovery running out of steam? The World Bank tells us why developing countries are being left behind in the bounce back from the pandemic slump. As inflation soars in the United States and Europe, we look at how the pace of price rises is calculated. Plus, a new kind of made-to-measure, the eco-conscious trend of pre-ordering clothes. Let's start with a warning that the global economy is entering a pronounced slowdown. The World Bank says that new Covid-19 variants and issues like inflation and debt are weighing on growth at a time when governments are winding down their support to the economy. Globally, the bank expects growth to slow to 4.1% this year and 3.2% next year. It's also warning that while richer countries are bouncing back to pre-pandemic levels of activity, developing countries are still far worse off. Let's speak now to Franziska Ohnsorge, who's manager of the Development Prospects Group at the World Bank Group. Franziska, thank you very much for being with us. Let's start with the economic recovery. Why are emerging and developing economies lagging behind in this economic bounce back?
Yeah, as you said, there's a steep slowdown underway, and it's happening before the recovery is complete in emerging markets and developing economies. Now, it's almost as if the two groups were on different flight paths. Advanced economies flying high and emerging markets and developing economies flying lower. There are many reasons, but one of the big reasons is a different policy stance. Both groups of countries put in place extraordinary policy stimulus during the pandemic, and that was needed. That was the way to handle some of the economic fallout. But emerging markets and developing economies have already been, forced, pushed, compelled to withdraw some of that stimulus. The inflation was running high already last year. As the recovery was just getting underway, already last year, more than a third of emerging markets and developing economies had to begin tighten monetary policy. Same with fiscal policy. Yes, they put in place extraordinary fiscal stimulus, unprecedented for emerging markets in 2020, but already half of that was unwound last year, just in that first year of recovery. And that's going to continue. In 80% of emerging markets and developing economies for this year and next, we expect fiscal policy to continue to be a drag on growth. So this is a big reason for these different flight paths between advanced economies and emerging markets and developing economies.
And why is that happening? Is it just the right response to inflation, or is it a question of resources not being able to access cheap money in the same way that richer countries are?
So usually you would not expect policy tightening before the recovery is complete. So many countries are pushed into this tightening well before the recovery is complete. Yes, as you said, by high inflation. Inflation in emerging markets, for example, is running at the highest level since 2011. So that's forcing a lot of them to tighten monetary policy. In fact, in half of emerging markets and developing economies that are inflation targeting, in half of the inflation is already above target ranges. That's for monetary policy. On fiscal policy also, there is a very tight constraint. A lot of them have very high debt. Government debt in emerging markets and developing economies is currently running at its highest level in 3 decades. That makes these countries very vulnerable to any financial market disruptions. So it makes sense to start to roll back some of that stimulus for safety reasons.
What could we do to help in that situation? Is it a question that organisations like yours need to be able to help on issues like debt relief, or is debt just something that we have to let the markets kind of sort out for these countries to be able to function?
Yeah, so there are many things that can be done both by countries to help themselves and by the international community to help countries. Countries can help themselves on the policy front, on the macroeconomic policy front, monetary and fiscal policies, by being very transparent, putting in place really well communicated, transparent plans to indicate to markets that how they're going to return to, say, fiscal sustainability, or how they're going to bring inflation back under control. Just build credibility. That's what countries can do. But the global community has also a big role to play. In two ways in particular at the current juncture. One way is to simply allow these countries to thrive, to grow, And one of the best ways of letting emerging markets and developing economies grow is to create an open and rules-based global trade and investment climate. But for those, there is another prong to this, the role of the global community. For those countries that are particularly highly indebted and who are very poor, the global community can do more to help them out of their debt overhangs with debt relief.
You're also noting in this research that in emerging and developing economies, income inequality has gotten so much worse during the pandemic. Why is that?
We have done our study for emerging markets, developing economies, and we find that there is a modest increase in within-country inequality. For advanced economies, other studies have shown that that was not necessarily the case. Now, our estimates look at only 1 year, 2020, the short-term impact of job losses and employment losses that were very concentrated among lower income groups on within country inequality in emerging markets and developing economies. That's 1 year. The problem is that these will be perpetuated because not only the job losses and the income losses in 2020 were concentrated among the lower income group, it's also the learning losses. The learning losses, the missed learning because of school closures was much higher among kids in households with lower income parents than in households with higher income parents. And that is likely to perpetuate itself, possibly even across generations. So this is likely to be a long-term increase in within-country inequality.
There's lots to be concerned about in your report. I wonder, are there any bright spots in it or points that we should feel optimistic about, given that we're nearly 2 years into this pandemic now?
Yes, there is one bright spot, that vaccination has proceeded. There has been progress made in vaccination. At this point, about half of the population of emerging markets and developing economies has received at least one shot. That's much more than we talked about 6 months ago in our last edition. But there's one group of countries that is left behind again, which is low-income countries. There, only 7% of the population have received one shot at least. So as long as these pockets of unvaccinated people persist, that we leave the door open for new variants to emerge.
OK, Franziska Ohnsorge from the World Bank Group, thank you very much for speaking to us.
Thank you.
Now, it's been an expensive start to the year for many households. Consumer prices continuing to rise at a pace not seen in decades in Europe and the United States. Inflation in the Eurozone hit a record high in December of 5%. While in the US, consumer prices jumped by 7%, the highest figure there in 40 years. With all this talk about inflation, we've been looking into how exactly it's calculated. Kate Moody, this has been your task for the week. What is counted when we calculate inflation?
Well, every month, national statistics offices gather the prices of thousands of different consumer goods and services in stores and online, and they compare the rate at which those prices are changing. The list stays pretty standard each month. It's the same kind of apples, petrol, or jeans, for example, as well as services like rent or hairdressing. That basket of goods and services is updated every few years to reflect changing spending habits. So the price of video streaming services has been brought in place of the price of video cassettes. The U.S. Consumer Price Index looks at 80,000 items which Americans buy in their everyday lives in different parts of the country.
So once the items have been selected, how do you decide how much influence each one has on the overall rate?
Well, the ones that are used the most or which represent the biggest slice of spending have more weight in the inflation calculations. In France, food is the most important factor, followed by health. The prices of furniture, eating out, rent, and clothing play a smaller role. In the U.S., items that are bought more often have greater weight, so changes in the price of chicken will impact calculations more than tofu. The U.S. also gives more weight to healthcare and college costs, which aren't as significant in Europe.
And even within the EU, you've spotted some interesting differences between how inflation rates are calculated.
Yeah, so the EU does have a fixed list of product categories, like food or drink, which each of its member states measure. That allows them to compare their data. But each country can adapt that list to best reflect consumer preferences. In addition to basics like bread and milk, the French basket tracks the price of things like snails and frogs' legs. Not necessarily everyday delicacies, but still on some French menus, while Germany's will include things like schnitzel and bratwurst. Whatever the inflation ingredients, the goal is to get an overall view of the cost of living and how it's changing.
Kate Moody, thank you very much. Next, to an eco-conscious trend in the fashion industry. Imagine going into a shop, picking out an item of clothing, paying for it, but then waiting months to actually take it home. Pre-order fashion is on the rise in France. UK Roy now reports.
They may not be tailor-made, but they are made to order. Thierry Edward Mouton's wardrobe contains some everyday ready-to-wear clothes, but with one major difference. They were pre-ordered, meaning he paid for them before they were made. He waited 3 months for this jacket to arrive.
J'oublie souvent que j'ai commandé. C'est presque se faire un petit cadeau à chaque fois aussi à soi-même.
More and more apparel makers are taking pre-orders, usually on their websites for a limited time, offering reduced prices. Some brands have opened showrooms. Customers come to try the clothes on, but leave empty-handed as there is no stock in store.
On produit ce que les gens ont commandé, donc il n'y a pas de surproduction. Nous, on ne fait pas de surstock qui traîne dans nos entrepôts. Et c'est sain à tous les niveaux, en fait.
This company even takes customers' feedback into the design of their clothes before they're made.
Presque un poil détendu, je pense, avec un renfort.
This business model has proven a success, with 120,000 clients bringing in 20 million euros in annual sales.
C'est effectivement les commandes des clients qui financent la croissance de l'entreprise. Donc l'entreprise n'a pas besoin d'aller lever des fonds, de faire entrer des investisseurs. Donc effectivement, c'est un modèle qui est franchement quasi parfait.
The growing trend is also helping factories. This one in central France is operating at full capacity throughout the year, thanks to pre-orders.
L'avantage principal de la précommande, c'est-à-dire qu'il n'est pas lié à la saisonnalité et à des collections spécifiques. Si elle tombe à un moment donné ou c'est une période de ce qu'on appelle d'intersaison, parce que ça permet de garder une charge de travail importante.
The firm expects pre-orders to make up 15% of its sales this year.
That's all from us for now, but you'll find this and all of our previous programmes on our website and the podcast, wherever you usually listen. Plus, you'll find us on social media for any of your comments or questions. Until next time, thanks for watching.